Welcome everyone to the Web Development Workshop. I'm Ishan. I'm going to be your presenter.
And I'm Uliyaah, and I'm also going to be presenting, and I'll be the one starting off this workshop. And first, I'm going to go over the two types of websites that can be created through web development, static and dynamic. Static websites are sites that have stable content, meaning that if you and I were to visit the same website and view the same page, it would look exactly the same. Static websites are usually used to showcase information like personal portfolios or maybe a restaurant's information, like its menu and its opening and closing times. And the second type of dynamic website the second type is a dynamic website. And to put it simply, dynamic websites are sites where the content can change depending on the user who accesses it, or a number of other variables, like with weather sites. The weather changes depending on the minute, so then it displays a new weather every minute. And there are also other examples of dynamic websites like Amazon, Twitter, Netflix, and these are all considered dynamic. And then on the next slide, we have some more examples. And you can see we have Facebook, Amazon, Canvas, LinkedIn, Stack Overflow. We have all of the ones here are considered dynamic websites. And then now that we have like a bit of a gist of the types of websites that we can create, we should see how we start creating them. And the first one we're going to go over is HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and is fundamental for creating websites since this is the file that tells our browser what content we'll be showcasing and the basic structure of the web page. So what I have here is a basic setup of an HTML file, and you can see that at the top we have something that's called a document type declaration, which tells our browser the version of HTML our page is written on. So on different browsers, the page will be rendered the same exact way. And without it, the browser will go into this thing called quirk mode, and to try to understand it, try to understand the code like it's written in a much older version of HTML, and this can lead to some weird errors. And then the next thing we have here is called a container tag, and all container tags are comprised of a starting and ending tag, and nested inside of them, we can add more content or other tags. And this specific tag here is called an HTML tag, which is where all of our code is enclosed in. And other than our document type declaration, which we have over at the top. And then the next tag here that I wanted to go over is also called a container tag, and it has the specific function of containing all of the metadata that we want the browser to know. And this data can include the title of the page, the description, and where we import resources we want to link to the file. And in this example, you can see we only told the browser that the title of our page is page title. And then we have our closing tag there, and you can see that there's a / before head, and that's how you know it's the closing tag. And then the next tag that I wanted to go over is the body tag, and this is also a container tag, and this is required for all HTML files. And this is where the majority of your code is going to be, like what you would see on your website is what you usually have typed out over here. Like right now you have the H1, which stands for header 1, and then P for paragraph, and then we have a div tag, and this is a container tag that separates some sections of your code so it's more organized. And if you want to just design that section, you can do that. And inside that, you can see there's a header 1 and a paragraph 2. And so in this slide, we can see the common HTML elements. And right here, we have the image tag, which is used to embed an image using a URL. And next we have a paragraph tag, which is used to add basic text. And then we have our header tags, and header tags range from header 1 all the way to header 6. And the larger the header number, the smaller the default font settings. And we also have our unordered list, and that's what UL stands for, and our tables. So in the next slide, I'll be going over one of the other core aspects of web development, which is CSS. And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And this is the file we use to style our websites and design it. And to design our page, there are 3 types of CSS selectors. And we use these to override the default appearance of our content. The broadest of the 3 would be the name-based selector, which changes the design of all the elements under the name. And in this case, that would be the paragraph, which is what the P stands for. And under the code, we could see what the text would look like on a browser. And you can see inside of our code, we said text align center, and that's why our text is aligned in the center instead of on the left, like it would be if we just set it to the default setting. And we have the color red instead of black, like the default setting. And then the next one we have here is a class-based selector, which is used for giving multiple elements the same design. And the way you declare the selector is by typing out a dot and then a descriptive name for its purpose. And in this case, we named the class center because it centers the text. And you can also see how the class center has been applied to 2 different elements here, a header or a heading and a paragraph. And then the last one I want to go over is the ID-based selector. And ID-based selectors are meant to be used in very specific instances where the design should only apply to one single element on your page. And as you can see, we named our ID para1 to stand for only the first paragraph to stick to this rule. And in our JavaScript section, I'll be explaining why this is important. So in our next slide, we have JavaScript. And this basically is how you manage the web page behavior. And in other words, this is how you make it interactive. So this is done by using selectors to find HTML elements that we want to interact with. What these selector functions do is return all the elements that match the argument of the specific function. And let's take a look at select by ID. For example, first, I just wanted to point out how it starts with get element instead of elements plural, like the other 2 selectors, which is because JavaScript only allows one element to use that specific ID name. And that's why when we're writing out our code in HTML and CSS, we want to make sure our element is only assigned to, our ID is only assigned to one element. And so moving on, we can see that the way that you write this out is first you write document and then .get and then element by ID. And then in parentheses, we have our argument, which is demo, which is the name of our ID. And for the tag names and class name selectors, the same order applies. But if there are multiple elements under the same tag or class name, it returns an array instead of just a single element, and it lists those multiple elements in that array. So in the next slide, we'll be dealing with event handlers and listeners, and you'll be able to see what these return elements are used for. And so event handlers are what we call the code that is run after an event listener is set off. And depending on what you set the argument to be, an event listener can be set off by a number of events, and the most obvious being when you click a button on a site and the event listener is set off, and the event handler takes you to a separate page or loads some information for you. And right here, we could see the list of events. And on change is when you make a change to the content of an element, like if you were to check or uncheck a box on a site. And then we have on click, and that would be if you were to click a button, that would set off an event. And if you were to hover over a specific element, that will also, that's what on mouse over stands for. And on mouse out is if you stop hovering over that element. On key down is when you press the down arrow key on your keyboard. And on load is once something is finished loading. And so the way you set up these event listeners is first you want to use the get ID element by get element by ID, or you could do get elements by tag name, and you set that equal to a variable, and that could be X. And then instead of element, you could put X dot and then add event listener. And in the parentheses, you would do the event, and in this case, it's click, and then your function. And we named that my function. And then that would call that function once the event is set off. And then next, I'm going to be passing it over to Ishan.
I'm Ishan, and we're going to be covering the previous slides, the content of the previous slides in the coding section. But for now, I'm going to present on some topics and content that you may encounter if you choose to go further into web development. So an important architectural pattern in web development is the model view controller. And the model view controller is meant to separate program logic into separate components. And there are three components that the program is separated into using the model view controller pattern. That is the view, the controller, and the model. So the model is responsible for storing and managing the data. And it primarily takes the form of databases. And then you have the view, which is like your user interface. And the view is where the physical user, clicks on some content of the website. So the view is like your user interface, like a web page or command line. And then you have the controller, which is the business logic. And the controller can be represented as the server of the program. And what the controller does is that it accepts and processes some of the input that the view sends in when the user performs some action, like say the user wants to like a post. So a post counter would be like incremented and sent to the controller, which processes that data. And then once that request is processed, either the controller could perform some actions or ask for some data from the model if the action performed by the view involves some sort of database request. And after the controller performs an action and is done, it sends a response back to the view and renders it, and the view renders this response as a pretty web page. A good analogy for this is an ice cream shop. So you're the view, the controller is the store worker who creates the ice cream, and the model is the rows of ice creams and toppings. So typically what we do when you make an order in an ice cream shop is that you ask the store worker to make an ice cream, possibly with your favorite toppings. My favorite topping is coffee, probably with some chocolate chips. So I send my order to the store worker, and then he being the controller, prepares that ice cream and gets the ingredients and all that from the model, and then sends it back to me for me to enjoy. So that's an example. That's a simple analogy of how the model view controller would work. And so as I mentioned before, the model view controller pattern involves sending data between the view and the controller. But how does that data get sent? So the protocol or the procedure of sending that data is through HTTPS. So HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it essentially involves sending text files over an internet connection. And then there are some common methods that take place in the model view controller pattern between that defines like the interaction between the view and the controller. Some of the key actions are creating a resource, reading a resource, updating a resource, and deleting a resource. So creating a resource corresponds to the HTTPS method of create, and then reading a resource from the controller involves the HTTPS method of get, and updating a resource involves the HTTPS method of put, and deleting involves delete. In our live coding section, we'll be going over the get request when we get some data from a public API. And so when you make a HTTPS request, you might encounter some status codes that tell you about the state of your request. So status codes 200 to 299 show that your request was successful, while 300 to 399 is used for a redirection, while 400 to 499 is a client error in your request. And a very popular type of status code that we might have encountered is 404. And that is when there's an error on our part, the user interface, where the resource cannot be found. And then we have 500 to 599, which are server errors. And this typically involves some error on the server's part, like either it could be down or some intern messed up the server. And then we have backend development and the controller. And so these are some of the technologies covered. These are some of the technologies you can use to develop a server. You don't have to use all of them, but just choose one and you'll be good. So we have Express.js, which is a backend framework that's written in JavaScript. And we have Flask, which is a Python backend framework. Then we have Ruby on the Rails, which is in Ruby. Then Django, which is Python. And then Asp.NET, which is in C#. And then Spring, which is in Java. So if you were to learn one, you'll be fine for quite a while. And moving on to the next slide, we have front-end web development, which is the view. And some of the tools used in front-end web development are, some of the frameworks are like React, Vue, and Angular. Well, of course, you can use JavaScript, but the convenience of React, Vue, and Angular is that you're able to create these components that allow you to combine JavaScript, HTML, and CSS all into one reusable component. Unlike in JavaScript, where you have to have three separate files for different tasks. And so here's a REST API model, which defines how the view interacts with the controller. So the view makes a request to the controller, and it could either make a get, post, put, delete request, and then the controller would send back data after performing some business logic in the form of JSON. And so this is a sample React component, and it shows you the simplicity of using some front-end frameworks. So here, so app is a component, and within this component, you can nest other components that take in some variable as inputs, so props. And this allows you to have both your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript nested as in one component, and it makes development pretty easy. So as for JSON, which is the format that the data of HTTPS is commonly sent as. So as for what JSON is, it's essentially a text file that's formatted as a JavaScript object. And the JavaScript objects are typically key value pairs. So the keys refer to some type of data. This data can either be arrays or arrays of objects or just numbers or booleans. And so then we have the model, which is essentially just databases. And one common type of database is SQL. And so SQL organizes data that preserves their relations. So it's pretty similar to an Excel sheet, and we use this. And SQL also provides a structured query language to query this data and return results that maintain the relations of this data. And some of the common SQL providers are PostgreSQL, MySQL, and SQLite. PostgreSQL and MySQL are like database servers, and SQLite, it's like a file server. It's like a file-based database. And then we have NoSQL, which means not only SQL. And NoSQL doesn't store data in a relational format, and it's not really in spreadsheets like SQL. And this allows for lots of scalability, but it doesn't lend itself well to being as recoverable or stable as SQL. And some common NoSQL database providers are MongoDB, which stores data as JSON documents. Then Amazon DynamoDB, which is like an AWS service that stores objects in key value pairs. Basically a hash map, which you might learn about in data structures. And there's also Neo4j, which stores data in a graph. And then that's it for the what's next section of what you could learn if you wanted to learn more about web development. And we can go to the coding section. So So right here, we created an HTML document, and we're running this HTML, and we can run this HTML document in our browser using the live server extension of VS Code. So this extension is used to run code live on the browser, and it's pretty neat. HTML document is currently running on port 5500. And if I navigate to my browser, you can see the code of this web page. And so I'll leave the explanation of the HTML to Uliyaah.
Okay. So if we're to start with, as I said, we always want to start our HTML document with a doc type declaration. And you can see we have it at the top there. And the way you write that is with an opening caret, and then an exclamation mark, and then doc type in all caps, and then HTML, and then you want your closing caret. And then the next thing we have here is the HTML tag, container tag, and you can see we set the language equal to English, and that's what lang is equal to. And that's all inside of our starting tag of our HTML. And then if you scroll down, you can see the closing tag, or scroll down, Scroll down, you can see that we have our HTML closing tag, and between this, you can see that's all our code. And so back to the top, we have our head, which I explained before has all of our metadata. And you can see here that we have our title, City Hacks Web Dev Workshop. And if you were to look at the tab description on your browser, that's what it would say, City Hacks Web Dev Workshop.
One second, my mouse disappeared.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
And you'd see it right there. Yeah. And then what we have next is the link to our style sheets, our CSS. And the way it's written, you can see there is with the opening caret, and then you write link, and then rel, and then you set that equal to style sheets in quotations. And then you have href, which stands for hypertext reference. And you set that equal to the path that leads to your file. And in this case, you would do a dot slash, and then since it's in the style sheets folder, you do slash style sheets, and then slash style.css, because that's the name of our file. And then next, since that's all we want to have in our head, we have our body. And we wanted to give our page a title so you know what you're looking at once you open it. And we used H1 because we want the title to stand out. And we said our header 1 is electric car charging station locator. And if you were to look at the browser, you can see that we have it right there at the top in bold and in bigger text. And then going back to the code, we have a header 2, which is H2. And then nested inside of that, we have a hyper reference link, or just like a link. And you start that with the opening caret, like all of your other tags, and then do A for attachment, and then href. And then you set that equal to the link that you want your text to go to. And then after that, yeah. And then you can see it opens up our dev post. And then looking back at the code, you could see that that hyper reference text, or the hypertext reference, is inside of our starting tag. And then between that, you have the text that you want it to go to. And then moving on, we have a div container. And this div tag, as I said before, can be used to separate sections. And what we did here is we included a paragraph tag to say, I will get to the nearest charging station any minute now. And then we closed off that tag. And then our next tag, we have an image. And we also added a class. And the way you set the image, like the class to a tag, is you do class equals, and then in parentheses, you say the name of the class. And in this case, it's rounded, since what we're going to be doing with that tag is rounding the edges of the image. And then next we have an src, and you set that equal to the URL that you want of the image that you want. And you can see if we go to the browser that we have a GIF, and that also works as an image. And you can see how the edges are rounded instead of like sharp edges like you might usually see. And then going back to the code, we ended the division, the section here, with an end tag. And then we moved on to making another paragraph tag. And we said, gas is expensive. Here is the list of the nearest charging stations. And then we just ended that too. And then the next thing we went on to do is created a button, and we set this button to the ID equal to charge BTN, which stands for button, because we wanted to give the name a meaningful meaning. And next, you can see that, and like I said before, you want to make sure that your IDs are assigned to only one element, and that's what we did here. And then next, you can see we close off that starting tag, and then we put the text we want that button to be linked to, and it says view nearest charging station, and then we close that button tag. And then next, we have our unordered list, which will list our the stations that are close to Sac City. And we attach the ID charge list to this element. And that's it. Oh yeah, and then we have our script that we're going to be needing to access the locations of our charging stations. And the way you write a script is with the open bracket or the opening caret, and then you do script src, and then you set that equal to the path that your script is in. And then in this case, it's /scripts because it's in the folder called scripts, and then you do another slash, and then the file name is querylocation.js, and then you close the parentheses and you close the script in the same way as your other tags. And then that's, yeah, all the HTML code.
So before we go to the JavaScript section, I'd like to add that when you can add HTML elements to when you add an HTML element to the HTML file and you have the live server React Code extension running, this update to the HTML file will also be reflected in the browser as well. So if I add in another list element, so electric charging location, this will be reflected in the browser, which is an HTML file which is running on the port 5500. So onto the CSS section.
Okay, so you can see that at the top we declared our class, and first we did a dot and then the class name. And you can see that we used brackets to include what we want our class to do. And for our rounded class, we wanted the border radius to be 20 pixels, which is what helps it to be rounded at the edges. And then next we have how do you declare an ID. And you do this by doing a hash, and then you do the name of your ID. And in this case, it's charge button. And next, you also have the brackets and include what you want your button to look like. And here we want the background color to be this teal color. And if you click that box, oh, Sean, can you click that? Oh no, can you go back to the code? And you click the box by the color.
Okay.
Yeah, it gives you the option to go around and change the color. So you don't need to like search up a website to find what color you want. And then next, there's also default colors that you can do. And right here, we have the color of the text that we're changing, and we're changing it to white. And that's one of the default options, so you don't need to type in a color code. And then next we have padding. So the text isn't squished to the side, and we have borders, but we don't want any borders, so we set that to none. And then the border radius again to round out the edges. And then we set the font size to 16 pixels. And then next we have the name-based selector. And we set, this is a name-based selector, and it's connected to the list. which is what LI stands for. And the background color we set is a kind of beige or yellowish. And then we set the color of the text also to white. And you can see that the padding, you don't need to write 10 pixels, and you could do percents instead if it's like something that might change, like the size of it. And then you have your width that's also set to percent, and our border radius that we set to 10 pixels also. And that's basically it for the CSS portion. So I'll pass it to Ishan to do the JavaScript.
Also, I'd like to add that the styles we made, also the color we changed right here, can also be seen in the browser as well when we updated it. So as for the JavaScript, what we want to do is when this query button is clicked, as you can see here, we want to display all the 10 nearest electric car charging stations. So to do that, first we want to get access to the button's ID, or we just want to get access to the button. So to do that, we already assigned an ID to the button. We can get the button by ID. So we do document.getElement by ID to store the button's ID, store the button, and then we store it in a variable called query button. Following that, we want to register an event listener to the button. And once the button's clicked, you want to send an API request, or rather, you want to perform some sort of function that is send an API request. So I predefined the API request function right here, and before we send an API request, we need to define some of the parameters for the API. So first off, I defined some of the metadata or the headers for the API request, and I specified that I want the data returned as JSON. As I mentioned before, JSON basically means JavaScript object notation, which returns textual data in the format of JavaScript objects. And a JavaScript object, it basically looks like this. It has a key which refers to some sort of variable. And as for what this variable means, the request options, it's meant to specify specifically what we want our request to be. So the method we use is get, since you want to get a resource from the API, and we want to pass in some of the headers so that the API we're going to be requesting is able to return our request more efficiently. Also, APIs typically take in some sort of parameters to help narrow down what responses or resources we specifically want. So the API we're going to be using is OpenCharge Map API, and it returns electric charging stations in the vicinity of certain coordinates. So the API serves some certain parameters as shown here. So we want all the electric charging stations to be from the United States. And for readability on the web page, I chose for the API to only return 10 results. Also below here, I assigned the latitude to be the latitude of Sacramento City College and the longitude to be Sacramento City College's longitude as well. Also, we need to specify an API key since most APIs require you to be authenticated to perform requests. This is mainly because they don't want the client to perform too many requests, and it's mainly meant to avoid denial of services or they don't want the client to like use this as a part of their own product. So anyways, right here, we're fetching the response from the open charge API, as you can see here. So we first pass in the URL of the endpoint we want to make a request to. So that being API to opencharge.map, and then / point of interest. And we also want to pass in some URIs, which specify some of the specific resources we want to access. And some of the parameters of this URI is the country code, the max results, the latitude and longitude, as we specified above. And we also have to include the key. This URI typically is different for each API, and each API has its own documentation of how they want your parameters to be structured. And so you really have to just look that up. And so when we make an API request, we don't really know how long it will take, or if it'll run at all. So we use the await keyword to wait for the API request to be fetched. And when you use the await keyword in JavaScript, you also and if that await keyword is nested in a function, you have to also provide the async keyword, which basically says that perform an asynchronous. This basically says that this function is performing some asynchronous activity that's going to be running in the background. And we also, right here, we're waiting for the request to be returned and converted to JSON. And once this is returned, we pass that response as a parameter to display charging stations, which is a function defined above that displays each address as a list element in the browser. But the reason why we have this API call in a try-catch block is because we don't really know if this API request will succeed or not. And so we need to try this API request, and if it fails, we catch the error. And if this API request succeeds, I'll show you what's going to be returned. So if it succeeds, it returns a 200 request, but I'm going to make the API request fail right now. So this site's supposed to be updating, but it's not. But if it fails, it's going to return a 404 error because the resource can't be found. And returning back to the code, once this request has successfully been stored in a response, we're going to run the display chargings function that displays each address in a list. So before we store the address in a list, we need to get access to the unordered list element, which is a parent element of the list. So as you can see here, the unordered list element is a parent element of each list element. And so we need to get this parent element and to be able to store the list element inside it. So remember back here, we got the response object, and since we are able to get access to the response object, we iterate over the response objects and store each response, which is basically an array of addresses inside the address local variable. And then And then after we iterate over the response and get each response, we create a list element and store the address in the list element. And after we create and store the address in the list element, we append the list element to the unordered list element. So if you take a look at the HTML, we're basically appending another list element to the unordered list. So since this list element is nested inside UL, it's a child of UL, the unordered list, and the unordered list is a parent of the list. And so after we've appended the list to the browser, we just log the address. So that's essentially what we're trying to do when we click the button. So here's a demonstration. So as you can see here, when this button is clicked, a bunch of list elements are rendered from the API we called. And so that's it for presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And since we have 10 minutes left, we're open to questions or anything like that to clarify any points you might have glossed over in the presentation.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm a little bit lost during the workshop. So I understand that to make a website with front-end and back-end, we can use like programming language like Python or JavaScript. And I wonder what's the role of HTML in the website development? Is it so?
Right, so the HTML is meant to structure the website elements.
Okay, so okay, I see.
So here, HTML is used to like lay down some of the elements of the website, as you can see here. Actually, a better example would be this site. So HTML is used to lay down some of the elements of the website, such as like titles, paragraphs, and stuff like that. And then CSS is used to style the elements, like apply colorings and round images, or like center content. So I hope that answered your question, but if not, could you clarify if it didn't answer?
Yeah. Okay. So what? So why do we need programming language like Python and JavaScript? Because I'm sorry.
Right. So in the backend section, we covered that, but I can cover it again. So what the front end does in relation to the backend is that the front end might request some resources like data from the backend, and then the backend, I'll go back to slides. This is the front end, which is like HTML. And then if the user wants some sort of resources from the backend, like it wants to view, like say you're on Facebook, right? And you want to view some of the like posts in the feed. The backend will send some data back of the post's information and the front end, and this will be displayed on the front end basically. So languages such as Python, Java, and all that serve as the server. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Any others? I'll post a link to the slides and the code below after the presentation ends, but it'll essentially be a link, a GitHub link. And the link will also contain the live site we've coded up. Do you guys have any further questions, or you can ask in chat as well later on?
Okay. If no one has questions, we can just end it right here, and then we'll give you guys the resources from our slides. Okay. Thank you guys for watching.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.